Hey everyone, welcome to Cloud Masters. I'm your host, Matan Bordeaux, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sam Clark. Today we're joined by Ronald Bradford and Adam North. They're both senior cloud data architects at DoiT International. They're here to highlight a forced version migration that's going to be impacting the RDS MySQL customers out there. But even if you're not using RDS, this episode is going to be really applicable to any service that you're using that's going through a forced migration either right now or in the future, for instance, Cloud SQL and Google Cloud. Before we jump into the topic, Adam, Ronald, maybe share a few words about what you do in your day-to-day and maybe even some history. As Ronald, I know you're pretty experienced with RDS specifically.
My name is Ronald Bradford. I'm based in US Eastern Time Zone, and my data specialty at DoiT here is to work with AWS, RDS, Aurora, and MySQL specifically. I've worked with relational databases now for over 3 decades, starting with Ingress, then Oracle and MySQL, as well as several other databases. And my time is also, in the past, I've spent time working for Oracle Corporation themselves and also MySQL Inc. prior to Oracle acquisition.
Adam North, Senior Cloud Data Architect here at DoiT as well. I work with our customers across clouds focused on data and databases. My background is a DBA. I worked for Bank of America for many years. I also built a cloud data platform on AWS. So yeah, whenever data is involved, I'm involved.
So just to set the stage here, last year, as I understand it, many RDS MySQL customers were forced into a major version migration from MySQL 5.6 to 5.7 due to end-of-life support and I guess no more availability of this version and of 5.6. And by we, I mean you two plus anyone else in your role focused on databases, saw many instances of customers not being ready or not planning accordingly for this forced migration and feeling a whole lot of pain as a result. And in the upcoming months, RDS MySQL customers are going to be forced into another, even more major version migration from MySQL 5.7 to 8.0, as 5.7 has reached the end of its life. And this migration is going to be way more impactful to customer application and business continuity than even 5.6 to 5.7. Why don't you two just start us off by telling us what exactly is going to happen? What is the current published timeline? And why does this matter to your application?
Yeah, sure. So I think just kind of important to highlight what end of life means, end of support. And so basically what it means is MySQL community will no longer be providing features, critical bug fixes, security enhancements, anything. So all of that will stop. I think it's October of this year, and then the cloud providers will come after that. And so I guess, Ronald, if you want to talk a little bit more of what that looks like historically.
Yes, Adam. So to understand a little bit more of the MySQL history, they used to release major versions on approximately a 3-year life cycle. So MySQL 5.7 was actually released back in October 2015. And 8.0 was released by Oracle Corporation after they acquired Sun in April 2018. So 5.0 has actually been around now closer to 8 years. There hasn't been a major release after 8.0 due to some architectural changes that have enabled additional features and functionality via plugins to be easily added to the version. I just want to point out here the other major open source version product that RDS supports is PostgreSQL, which has an annual release cycle for new releases and correspondingly has an annual release cycle for deprecations of old versions. So generally they keep about 3 years of versions available. So MySQL has actually been a little bit more lenient than that here.
Yeah, so I guess we didn't really talk about why it matters to the application. And so just to, basically if you hit a bug or if there's some security vulnerability detected, you're pretty much going to be on your own after specific dates. And, everyone's applications are using databases. Databases are at the center of everything. If your database is hacked or something like that, your business will be crippled, right? And so that's kind of the risk of letting this happen.
Playing devil's advocate then, and assuming that I'm a customer that doesn't care about security, like obviously we hope there's none of them around. Is this a case of I can leave my system running in an unsupported method, or am I going to be unable to, for example, restart my server because it's going to automatically update itself, or what's going to happen?
So, Sam, that's an important distinction between running MySQL as a hosted product with, for example, on EC2 versus MySQL being run within AWS's managed services. So if you are running MySQL yourself, yes, you can continue to run an unsupported version of the product, and you can accept the risk of not having any security patch updates or any level of support. But the cloud providers who provide managed services basically, move towards end of life for the product so that the cloud provider themselves, AWS in this example, is not then not required to perform those updates. The upstream provider is no longer performing them, and they don't want to perform that as well. So that's the distinction between a self-hosted version or an on-premise version and a managed service version. You will be forced into that simply because they want to remove that product from their feature set.
And I recall reading, and maybe it was talking to you about this, Ronald. Maybe you mentioned this to me, but did AWS offer recently some like a way to pay to continue using 5.7?
Yes. So there are actually two ways to potentially avoid performing this upgrade to MySQL 8.0 in the current time frame. That time frame at the start of this year was September of 2023, and later it was December, and now it's been pushed back to March of 2024. So there are two technical ways that you can avoid doing an RDS MySQL upgrade. The first is the option of extended support for an end-of-life product, which AWS announced just last month in September. And while that sounds good, which means that you can delay a migration, the fine print will say that this will cost you approximately 40% for the first year, and then additionally higher charges for subsequent years. So you're not avoiding performing a migration, you still have to do it. You're just delaying the inevitable and paying more for it. And there is a second option, which is if you're using RDS MySQL, and that is to move to AWS's cloud native database, which is called Aurora. So you can move to a MySQL compatible version of RDS Aurora with 5.7, and that'll buy you approximately another year before you reach end of life of that version. However, switching from RDS to RDS Aurora is basically a migration. You need to perform the same tasks. So you're not avoiding a migration, and in fact, you're adding one because next year you're going to have to migrate from 5.7 to 8.0 in Aurora anyway.
I sort of, a couple of times on this podcast have come in and said, I'm not the data guy, right? And so that's great to have you guys here. Obviously, I've learned about databases over my career and know a bit about them. What's the major thing about a database engine upgrade in this situation? I mean, I guess if you're using a database like RDS at its most basic and you just got a relational database with tables and whatever, then that's a very simple upgrade because tables are tables and they still function the same under a new engine. Where are the big changes between 5, 7, and 8 that customers need to be aware of?
So I'll take that and talk a little more generally. Pretty much across all databases, whether it's open source, closed source, major database versions include overhauls of the database optimizer. And you just don't know what you're going to get from a performance perspective when you apply the new binaries, when you upgrade your database. It's just, you never know what you're going to get. And often you find yourself having to tweak parameters, add new indexes, rewrite queries completely. And I guess, from a MySQL perspective, I'd be curious to have Ronald kind of elaborate a little bit more. But yeah, that's what I've seen. There's always something.
So if you had a very straightforward database, Sam, as you mentioned, it's quite possible that you don't need to take on new features that are coming out in the new version. But a change of version may have taken something that was deprecated and now has removed that piece of functionality. And if you haven't been keeping up to date in versions, you may need to, change some functionality in that respective. Another common problem is the introduction of additional reserved words. So something that did work in a prior version now is incompatible, even in the most basic applications. But as Adam talked about, the change to the optimizer or a change to the concurrency model is generally the largest impact in any product. And between 5.7 and 8.0, it's very significant for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that MySQL, unlike many other products, supports different underlying storage engines. There's the default storage engine, which is NoDB, and there are a number of other storage engines. And in 8.0, they have moved towards supporting, in 8.0, they've moved to supporting, in addition to that, the Oracle's version of HeatWave, which is a data warehousing type solution. So the optimizer is now catering for different types of patterns of data which you want to retrieve. So just natively now, a query that may have performed a certain way using indexes in a particular way is now doing that differently. And so the most basic thing is it has the query execution plan changed. The other thing that's really significant between 5.0 and 8.0 is that there was a lot of work done to improve the concurrency of the databases. There used to be a real tipping point in less than 1,000 concurrent connections with MySQL, and in 8.0 they spent a lot more effort in enabling higher concurrent versions of systems to support many thousands of connections. So what actually happens is if you have a low volume infrastructure, low concurrency, your queries will naturally take longer in 8.0, just simply because it's been re-architected to support greater concurrency of connections. So it's important to note that, features can have a positive impact on new functionality or bug fixes or optimizations, but it can have a negative impact on more traditional ways that you may have worked on. And just one more thing regarding the queries. In early versions of MySQL, there were various ways in which you could trick MySQL into doing something specifically for the query execution, as MySQL does not pin a query execution plan. It recalculates that every time. And people may have had these particular hints or techniques or different types of indexes in place over prior versions, and now they just no longer apply in 8.0. And so review of your structure, review of your queries is necessary to achieve comparative performance between your current version and the next version coming up.
So leads me to a follow-up question. My mentors back in AWS used to always bang on about the best practice here being separate your data and your code, right? Don't put your code in your database, because I think a lot of people have done that, especially, with Oracle. That was probably one of the most popular places to see millions of lines of code stored in a database. Is it realistic? Is it in the real world, is it realistic that people can separate that and can make these migrations easier? Or is that just not the case and everyone's going to have a lot of testing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I can tackle that. So I think, regardless of where your code runs, whether it's inside a stored procedure or from the application, from a prepared statement, from SQL Alchemy or whatever, I mean, it still needs to go through the optimizer. And so there are, of course, going to be different nuances to each, but ultimately, yeah, every line of code is going to need to be tested.
Yes, so I think the most overlooked requirement for a migration, and actually the simplest of several core pieces of things that you need to do in any migration from a technical perspective or a management perspective, is actually test your application. When it comes to a relational database, that's very easy. You capture every SQL statement that you execute, you log it, you analyze it, you review it, you time it, and then you repeat that process on new versions. And it's a very straightforward technique that doesn't require knowledge of the application or a lot of other tooling. So it's very important that you have knowledge of your application. The knowledge of your application is not really required. You can sort of create very simple tooling to perform that task, and most organizations don't actually capture the SQL that they're executing, whether it's in a stored procedure or whether it's in the code. So as part of this podcast, we're actually going to be releasing a couple of blog posts as well talking specifically around how to capture SQL statements and the best ways to analyze those with regards to MySQL. Moving the code from the database into the application simply just moves the complexity. Adam made reference to SQL Alchemy. That is one of many ORMs that many application developers now use as yet another abstraction layer to generate SQL statements that need to connect to the database. And ultimately, the greatest impact in performance for a database is not actually the SQL statements, it's actually generation of... The greatest performance impact is not actually the SQL statements that have been well written or need to be tuned, it's the generation of statements from ORMs that actually cause downstream problems, and then the inability of the application team to know how to modify or adjust those, or to be able to add hints to them, to be able to have a application that supports feature flags or rate limits so that you can control things more dynamically in between the interaction between the application and the database itself. Testing individually is important, but as I also mentioned, particularly with 8.0 and with any application, in real life, testing concurrency is the thing that you need to do. Everyone has different workloads. Those workloads can change at different times of the day. And so they may switch between write heavy to read heavy. And the interaction of all of those can have an impact on the performance of individual statements. So testing is a multi-tiered approach, but the first simple level to verify, does something that work in the prior version work in the current version? That's very easy to know, to see whether there are now warnings or errors, or it's returning different results, which is also another key consideration. You need to make sure it actually performs what it's supposed to perform, and it's actually performing at an acceptable response time.
This is not to say where you should place your business logic. That's a whole nother podcast. But either way, yeah, everything Ronald just said, you have to make sure you test everything thoroughly. And but the age-old debate of where I put my business logic is certainly a fun topic that could be a whole podcast in itself.
So what I'm hearing that is it might make the actual SQL server migration slightly smoother, depending on where the data is or not, but it doesn't change the amount of effort you need to put into testing and ensuring that your code is still correct and still performant and efficient and so on.
Right. So when it comes to MySQL specifically, there's a well-known migration path, which is sort of the migration of implementing a replica of the new version and to fail forward into that new version. There isn't a well-trodden path for having an automated rollback and, replaying of operations that are occurring in the new version in case of an unsuccessful migration you wish to fail back with no data loss. So the emphasis of this very common practice, which has been around for several decades with MySQL, the rolling upgrades in the newer versions, is to do as much preparation as you can before the point of no return. And there are very simple design patterns, architectural design patterns that applications can use that will enable you to do this two-way door testing, to be able to test the old version and the new version concurrency at no impact to the risk of, your system being unavailable or not performing. And, we harp on testing because that's the easiest way to have a higher level of confidence that when you do a migration that you have a greater opportunity for success. Now, with 5.6 to 5.7, there were some issues that caused customers performance problems, and there were features and deprecations as well. With 5.7 to 8.0, there is a guarantee that something will not perform as expected. And so testing will only take you so far. Having a preparation plan of what do I do when something does not perform as expected. What's going to be the executive decision-making processes for continuing to fix forward or accepting a data loss and to roll back. So there's a lot more involved. And with this version change and the support cases that we have and the information over the time, like I said, 8.0 has been around for now 5 years. So some organizations have been performing this operation in their own hosted environments for quite some time. There's a guarantee that you will hit some problem, and having an appropriate plan in place is very important. And then doing as much testing beforehand just raises the level of confidence so that a technical portion of the organization, operational manager or an engineering manager can put forth to business owners, yes, we have a high degree of confidence because we've done all of this preparation work beforehand.
You've kind of hinted at that with the testing. It sounds like it's one part of a roadmap or of a kind of a plan that people should follow for really any successful migration. But if you had an ideal roadmap for how customers can implement successful migration, maybe generally, and also if there's any nuances with respect to RDS or MySQL, what would that be? What would that look like?
It all starts with planning, and planning involves all sorts of things, right? Establishing a business owner, establishing what the goal is, establishing what the recovery point objective is. So like, how much data can we lose if the upgrade doesn't go well? And so there's just all sorts of things to consider. And so as part of this podcast, we are also releasing a checklist that can kind of help customers look at and kind of review some of these things that you might not think of, especially. So there's, we work with a lot of startups, and so a lot of startups are just, they've been on 5.7. That's what their startup was built on, right? And so they've never actually gone through this before. And so if you haven't gone through this before, creating a checklist or just using our checklist as a starting point to get your brain thinking through some of these topics is going to be huge. So that should be in the show notes here. And then, on top of planning, identifying all these things, there's just different levels of testing, right? I mean, there's smoke testing. So smoke test very quickly. Smoke testing basically means, maybe we send one work item through the system, and we just make sure there's nothing's on fire, right? That's what a smoke test is. And you can do that as soon as possible, right? You don't have to wait until you've rehearsed all of your cutover procedures. You don't have to, you can just clone your dev database, upgrade it, and then launch the application, right? And just see what's burning. And that's kind of going to give you a really good initial set of things that you might need to remediate. So then your development team can start working on that stuff while you start to work on the more complicated things.
So, just to add also to that planning portion of it, now that we're really moving into, cloud native architectures for most organizations, and pretty much every organization will have integration partners. Those may be people that are actually consuming the data that you're providing, or you're integrating with third parties that may offer authentication or payment systems or those sort of things. So the planning portion and the roadmap not only includes your internal requirements, which may also impact what are your engineering teams doing for product features, but you may also need to notify customers of any potential outage that may happen if you're going to choose to have an outage window. Also making sure that it doesn't align with something else that's of significant nature that's coming forward. So the planning is, it's really has to take a holistic view from the top down. And we talked about testing. If we had 4 points, one being planning and 2 being testing, the other 2 would be always be prepared. No matter how well you test, you need to have an assumption that something will fail. And so what is the strategy for that failure? Adam talked about, the recovery point objective, RTO, RPO, MTTR, mean time to resolve, are all very important things that should be documented and should be defined. And then also, how long can we run in a degraded mode or a non-performing mode before a specific person has to make a decision, and who is that person? So being prepared means this sort of like, you've run through a scenario, for lack of a better word, you've done a DR test. And as Adam pointed out, in a startup, you may have never actually gone through this before. And in larger commercial organizations, people do limited DR testing. And so it's very difficult if you're doing a migration. Migrations always happen late at night or on the weekends. And without the plan, then it's like, well, who am I going to wake up to help, fix this code problem? Or I have an issue. Can I raise a manager now to make a decision on these things? So that preparedness is, in addition to the regular plan. And the last point I would say is that being proactiveness is the key to doing migrations. You should never leave it to the last minute. You shouldn't leave it to the fifth notification that AWS has sent you to upgrade your database, because you do not want to get into the situation where RDS will automatically upgrade your database for you during your maintenance window, which will be at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, and then you haven't done adequate testing, and then if your system is not operating as expected, who's going to fix that problem? You've now moved from being proactive to being reactive when you're on fire. And so if you don't have a good plan in place, you may make additional rash decisions, which could have larger implications moving forward. So that's important. And I would just say the other thing about proactiveness and any type of these things is you need to always anticipate the unexpected. And I just want to go back to something that happened several years ago. Most people didn't expect the Meltdown Spectre critical bug fixes. And if practically every organization was affected, and in some organizations where I was working at the time, that took 3 months out of engineering and operations time to actually rectify these critical bugs that were identified. So that pushed every single thing out. And if you're planning to do a migration, but now you can't do that because you're now stuck on a more critical security fix, then leaving things to the last minute can overload resources and cause sort of like a rolling stone downstream effect.
It sounds like, based off just the timeline you described and the alternatives, one being a 40% price hike to keep 5.7, the other, adding a migration by switching to Aurora for just a year. It sounds like anyone who's affected or impacted by this specific forced migration should, if they haven't started already, start now.
Yes, I mean, if you have been running 5.7 now for up to a year, AWS would have already made notifications at the start of the year, the end of September, so you would have already been receiving email and console notifications to do that migration. And yes, the date has slowly moved, and now it's between December and February. Of course, it may move slightly again, but there are situations where AWS will just actually perform the migration. So there is no easy out to this. And sooner or later, you will need to do a migration. And one of the apprehensions that people have is that if they're a newer organization, they've done one migration and it didn't work very well because they didn't run through a sort of a solid playbook of being prepared and having a good test strategy and having a what-if analysis for, problem A or problem B. And so now they're a little shy of running another migration, where really migrations themselves should become part of your regular release cycle. You need to have an open source cadence for software management for any type of software product. And so migration should just be part of the extended version of your deployment lifecycle. And then it will become much more easier for organizations to have a high level of confidence. And nothing's worse than when you're a technical person and your system is on fire, and to then have management and executives go, well, how long is the system going to be unavailable because our customers are being impacted? Sometimes it's very difficult to give an answer if you've not experienced it, if you've not role played what happens in this what if scenario. What do I do when this situation happens? How do I cater for this and this other situation? And then also, when you actually run through those scenarios, you realize that there are engineering architectural practices that can support many situations, but your engineering organization or your product or your ORM framework does not offer those features. So by investing time ahead, again, this whole proactiveness also in architectural design, by investing that time ahead of time, you can mitigate downstream effects, whether that's sharding your application, whether it's supporting read writes. Can your application run in read-only mode, for example? And do you have rate limits and feature flags in place to be able to turn off certain functionality that may be performing poorly, but enabling everything else to operate? So as you go through more and more migrations and you get better and better at planning, executing, and seeing less and less percentages of failures, you can also feed that back into, well, how do we make our entire life cycle, including software and engineering and even management decisions, better to make migrations more part of a well-accepted, well-proven, and successful operation that you do.
So we've talked really heavily on specifically AWS RDS and alternatives with Aurora. Obviously, this is based on MySQL being a community edition and an open source, essentially, product. So the same issues are going to be happening with Google and Cloud SQL. Have you guys got any inside information or do you know anything specific about what their plans are with upgrade? I haven't seen any notification from Google about an extended support offering.
So we don't have any official information, but based on what we know right now, the notice should go out in December that Cloud SQL will be off support by next December. So 2024 December. December 2024 is what we're anticipating to be the end of support for Cloud SQL, MySQL.
So one of the things that I've noticed with Google customers is that Amazon sometimes tend to sort of over-communicate the maintenance windows, and they'll tell you 30 times it's coming, we've moved it, it's not happening, it is happening, it's not happening, and go on and on. Google, on the other hand, tend to sort of just do it and check if you noticed. Do we know if they're sending out notifications on this one?
Yeah, so the policy is they will send an email notification 1 year before the end of life. So that's why we're saying, so at the earliest it would come out this month or November, because we haven't seen it yet in October, right? So the earliest it'll come out is November, which would mean you have until November. But based on, I think there's one of those Google community threads, one of the engineers mentioned December, the notice should come out in December. So it's looking like it's going to be at least December at the earliest, and that would mean December of 2024. So hopefully no surprises. That's how it's supposed to work. We will see.
Yeah. And
Yep.
I'll add to that too, is that, we've talked about AWS and we've talked about GCP. We mentioned earlier running your open source database self-hosted on one of those clouds, or you may be running the database on-prem and you may be considering a cloud migration at some point in time in the future. So those are other, there are other impacts that don't fall into a managed service timeline for a forced migration, but may force any decision that where you are doing some type of moving to managed services or moving to the cloud, that you may then be forced into that change because the product is no longer supported as well. So, there are other users, there are other customers, and there are other companies that have not yet considered moving to the cloud or moved to the cloud in part. That will be ongoing. So while we see that this is going to be a problem for AWS in the coming months, and we anticipate that'll be a problem for GCP customers up until the end of next year, there will be a long tail. There will be customers that will be migrating to managed services from cloud-hosted services and customers migrating from on-prem that will also potentially go through this. So as part of DoiT and our support services that we offer, every time we go through one of these cases, we identify something that's different. We have a number of data architects all around the world, 24/7. Just myself, I'm just one person in the US, and I have at least two support tickets a week just on MySQL 5.7 to 8.0. And some of those are from, how do we do it, to, oh, by the way, we, just did a migration and we didn't tell you, and now we're on fire. And that's a common situation that we have, and that leads to the anti-patterns that the customer has used, and as opposed to coming back to sort of being more regimented in how do you perform a migration, irrespective of the product and irrespective of the version, and how to avoid common problems that we see regularly. And I will say I've been doing 5.7 to 8.0 migrations in and outside of AWS now for more than 3 years, and we still see edge cases of something that I hadn't seen this situation before. It's a less specifically used thing, such as a geometry column, or some other particular setting that is not as common. So the list of known problems is not definitive right now. It's certainly reaching an apex, and we've seen a lot of those. Our knowledge base has a lot of those, and so we will continue to refine that. And once we overcome AWS, we move to GCP, we should have a pretty good idea of most of the possible implications. As Sam is crossing his fingers, yes, that is definitely not the right way to plan and strategize database migration.
Real men testing prod.
On the on the topic of edge, well, not really, kind of the opposite of edge cases. I love, for anything really, I love example scenarios. You mentioned 2 tickets a week at least just on this. Are there any interesting examples or experiences you had with customers, whether it's like a forced rollback or anything else that maybe those people listening or watching this can learn from? Mistakes made, what should be done instead?
Yes, there are a couple of common patterns that we see. The first is that the customer has already performed the migration, and as a DoiT customer, we were unaware that was happening. We weren't involved in the, have you checked this and have you checked this? And so we get an urgent ticket. We're on a call immediately with the customer, and we're trying to understand their exact problem. Depending on the customer, we may not have intimate knowledge, or depending on the time zone in which they've done that, our architects in those time zones may not have intimate knowledge of the customer's environment and architecture. And, a case earlier this year, there was a situation where the customer decided that they needed to fail back. And so they hadn't had a plan for that, and they hadn't considered, that we would lose data with regards to that. And so, these are several anti-patterns that come into play, which is like, okay, do you have a plan of how long you'll run in a degraded mode before you choose to revert? What is the impact of data loss? And, in this particular situation, this was a classic example, like many, where, we just migrated, but we didn't actually do any testing. We didn't do any load testing. We don't have a framework in place to be able to verify something in version A versus something in version P. We haven't logged that. Now we've shut down the old service, so now we can't actually see what it did look like, or they don't have appropriate observability in place. So having those things in place, that's something where DoiT can help assist in, like that checklist that Adam was talking about. Do you have A, B, and C ready? The other big issue that I'm seeing right now is that people are now seeing that they need to do this migration. And we talked earlier about, RDS MySQL and RDS Aurora MySQL, which sound very similar. They are compatible in terms of the communications between the server, but the underlying architecture is different, and the performance implications are different, as well as the, cost and features that are available. And a recent case I just had was a customer wanted to move from actually running on EC2 directly to Aurora and change a version at the same time, as well as take functionality which they were using in their hosted version, which is not supported in RDS. So it's important to highlight all those things and to say to the customer, yes, you're planning on going from situation A to situation D, but really you need to consider a migration from A to B, and a migration from B to C, and a migration from C to D, so that if you do encounter any unforeseen issues, where's the root cause of that problem, and to have a plan in place to look at it. And that doesn't mean at the end that you need to actually perform 3 migrations, but what it means is that you have to test those 3 migrations to an adequate level of satisfaction to minimize what the problem is. So I'm seeing people now that are moving to, we want to adopt cloud native MySQL services or PostgreSQL services, and they're running older versions, and they're hitting the exact problem that this podcast is all about. The MySQL community version has reached end of life. It's October. It is now no longer officially supported for bug fixes or support tickets. And if you're running that or an older version, you have to make a decision, how long do I accept that risk before I need to either perform an upgrade on my own host service, which will be the same migration problem between 5.7 and 8, or do I move to a cloud managed service, which will offer different features and functionality, but is still a migration? You can't get out of the migration. The migration is inevitable.
That one example just sounds crazy. The customer trying to do 3 different very complex things simultaneously.
The customer wasn't actually aware that they were actually going to go through 3 complicated I think that was the important thing. Was this is a good example where a customer was proactive in seeking input and expertise from our deep pool of experts. And this was the case that I was working with. Was I was able to point out that these are actually individual migrations on their own, and each of them have an implied risk. So a takeaway from customers and prospects that are listening to this podcast is that DoiT does also help customers in just discussing what is the approach that you would take with performing this migration. What have you seen that have been the situations that are most easily avoidable, and what are the risks that you could see?
I think in Australia they refer to that as a kangaroo's breakfast, that type of situation.
No, I think the Australians on the call are saying no.
I quickly looked up. What's the equivalent Australian euphemism for storm, because that situation sounded like storm.
I think kangaroo's breakfast is the sort of thing they use in the tourist books.
This is why I need to upgrade to ChatGPT 4.5 and not use this 3.0
I believe
stuff.
that's the reason why people think that Foster's is Australia's best beer. Foster's is Australia's best export beer because Australians won't drink
it. Sorry, Adam, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that the kind of other most common thing we see is just a performance regression, and that's true whether it's MySQL 5.7 to 8, Postgres 9.6 to 11 or 13, whatever, right? And so use the built-in tools that RDS and Cloud SQL give you, right? Make sure that you have captured your performance baseline. You can do this using performance insights. You can do it using query insights in Cloud SQL. Make sure that you can clone your instance and you run the same test against the upgraded instance, and make sure you're capturing the data, and you can just compare the performance before and after, right? It's not the hardest thing to do, but a lot of customers just don't take the time to reproduce their workload in the staging. You just do that, you'll really set yourself up for success, and you can do it using cloud data tools to a reasonable degree of certainty. Obviously, there's other tools out there that go deeper in performance, but I mean, if you don't have any of that stuff, just use the built-in performance metrics that they give you. Reproduce your.
Yeah, we're running up on time. I just wanted to see if there's any final thoughts. Donnybrook was the phrase I was thinking of. There we go.
I must admit, it's not common that there are 2 Australians on a phone call unless we're dealing with our APAC colleague.
This is our first for Cloud Masters.
All right.
There will be. I'm sure there will be more. We have a lot of very highly skilled individuals in APAC, and so I'm sure you'll get a chance to listen to those people. I guess any parting words. As Adam said, using instrumentation and knowing the instrumentation is important. It doesn't need to be a major migration. It simply could be that the small version of embedded code of a Node.js library that everybody uses changes, and that now impacts the application automatically. And if you didn't have appropriate observability in place, then you may not know that now that's performing not as well as it was previously. That's not even a developer or engineer's introduced issue by changing some existing functionality. There are many layers in which a regression can occur. And so having an audit trail of the knowledge of your application, how it works, how it performs, having an audit trail of how your application performs, its latency, its throughput capabilities, and actually even the results that it returns is important, so that you can always be testing that, and you can be adding that to a normal CI/CD pipeline, a normal life cycle for rolling out of even just, changes for your normal engineering product. So it's just a good practice all around, and it's not limited to databases and not limited to caches. It should be applicable to pretty much anywhere in which you want to store and retrieve data.
Great final words. I also didn't anticipate this cracking over 40 minutes, but I think just because RDS is one of the most widely used services in AWS, at least among our customers, and just the lessons learned can really apply to all services. I'm also not surprised that we were able to fit so much content in this time. But thank you, Ronald and Adam, for joining. And to those listening or watching, stay tuned for the next episode, and have a great day wherever you are.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
See you
guys.
later.
Okay.
Cloud Masters is a DoiT multimedia production, hosted by Matan Bordo, Product Marketing Manager at DoiT, and Sam Clark, Technical Account Manager at DoiT. Our guests this week were Ronald Bradford, Senior Cloud Architect at DoiT, and Adam North, also a Senior Cloud Architect at DoiT. Editing and production of Cloud Masters is handled by me, Crispin Stanback, Multimedia Content Producer at DoiT. To hear more episodes of Cloud Masters, and to learn more about how DoiT delivers the true promise of the cloud with ease, not cost, visit doit.com for additional resources.